This is a heck of a deer.
Giant Eurasian brown bear in Croatia right here.
When I set out to do the sheep slam with the muzzleloader, I had no idea what it was going to take.
Hey everybody, got an awesome guest on today, Ivan Carter. So if you follow along the hunting industry or conservation over the years, you know that Ivan has played a big role in it, both from the hunting side and now most recently the conservation side. So today we're going to cover his history, how he got into hunting, how it kind of transitioned from big game hunter, PH, into solely conservation, his work that he's doing now, how he sees the future in conservation and hunting. This is one that I've been looking forward to for a long time. So here we go.
I'm going to say this, almost everybody knows Ivan as Africa, but you just mentioned you're actually from the States, correct?
No, I'm from Zimbabwe. I
Okay.
live in Zimbabwe. I lived in Zimbabwe my whole, I was born there, grew up there. Then Zimbabwe went through its whole political thing, and that's when we moved to the States.
Uh-huh.
Lived
What
in
year
the
would that
States.
have been?
Probably in the early 2000s, like 2000 to 2010, somewhere around about there.
Now, and when you say went through there, so I've hunted Zimbabwe a couple of times, so I've heard stories from PHs and so forth of what it is. I'm guessing almost all of my listeners have no idea what you're talking about when you say when Zimbabwe went through it. Just explain what it is real quickly.
Yeah, so Zimbabwe, it's an unbelievably beautiful country. It was a very vibrant country with a very healthy economy. And the government at the time, we went through a civil war in Zimbabwe in the 70s. I was just a little kid then. But one of the things that happened is the party that took over Zimbabwe, and I'm trying to give you the Reader's Digest version, had promised all of the people that fought land. And then said, we're going to take the land and give it to everybody. That didn't happen. And after about 10 years of being in power, the government then decided to start appropriating the land. So, there was this enormous, almost a revolution where they just literally, all the white-owned farms got taken over by government. And the white-owned farms were the ones that were producing all of the food. Those were given to the people who didn't have the ability or the knowledge or the wherewithal to know how to run these commercial farms. And so the economy tanked. The country was very, very close to a civil war. It was very violent, very lawless, highest inflation rate ever in the world in history. I mean, you'd go into a supermarket and there wouldn't be anything on the shelves because they couldn't afford to buy the stuff for what they were selling it for because the money was devaluing so fast. I mean, I was at a point, Mark, where you'd go out for dinner and you'd take a wheelbarrow full of money, no joke. And so it was just crazy. And then, our farm got taken over. And so what would happen is you would get a letter in the mail, and whether or not that letter stood, in a court system, there weren't any court systems that were working. They very violently took away all of these farms. And so, I arrived in America literally with $400 in a suitcase with someone that I'd previously had on safari who, truly took me into their home and helped me get a visa and helped me understand how to live in America. And so, I was very proud of that. We lived in America for about 10 years, never could get permanent residency, which is a really hard thing to do if you follow the right channels. So we then went to the Bahamas, lived in the Bahamas for a while. My kids were both born in America. We lived in the Bahamas for a while. And then as the kids got older, I realized that, the freedoms that we enjoy in Africa are something that is a great way for kids to grow up. So, we moved back to South Africa. My kids are in school here and, we really enjoy the freedoms. I mean, we live in a very safe part of the country and there's enormous amounts of wildlife and outdoors living and hunting and fishing and horse riding and motorcycles and everything that lively kids thrive on is here. And, I'm not sure, my daughter has her own television show. She's got a very vibrant social media following. She loves the conservation component of all of that. My son is a mad, crazy motocross rider. And so the freedoms that they have from being here in Africa and what we can give them for 10 cents on the dollar it really makes us very attractive, you know?
Yep. How does, and you mentioned the freedoms, like how does the big one here in the US is, if you've had kids here, is their time on phones and so forth. Like how does that vary over there? Like the amount of time on social media and stuff like that compared to here in the States?
It's really interesting, Mark. That is a family thing, not a society thing. So
Yep.
our kids, it's only in the last year that they've been allowed their phones during the week. Up till now, we've had a policy of 0 screen time during the week, nothing, not one moment of it. But they were allowed to have as much iPad or TV as they wanted before breakfast on a weekend, which got them to bed on the weekends. They got to watch it, but then after breakfast, unless if you've got terrible weather and so on, then we might curl up in front of the TV and watch a movie. But in reality, during the week, there was no screen time. And, I'm dead against screen time. Now, as I mentioned, my daughter's got a very vibrant social media following and multiple pages, and she doesn't know that she's got that. None of my kids have social media. Yep. We still limit them to about 45 minutes a day maximum on their phones. My son's at boarding school. He's allowed 15 minutes a day on his phone. And that's to phone home and make plans for the weekend or whatever it is. So my wife gets to talk to her little boy once a day for 10 minutes. And then my daughter's not allowed her phone at school. And, when she gets home, we only allow her to communicate with friends about homework assignments and things like that. And I know that sounds very draconian, but the reality is my daughter is a great horse rider. They know how to build horse fence. They both know how to ride the tractor and do chores and all of that. And a lot of their friends are really good at, at whatever the game of the week is. And that's where it starts and ends. So I really think it's discipline that starts at home. We can't expect society to discipline our kids for us.
100%.
And, I think my kids love and thrive and enjoy the outdoors because I kind of nudge them in that direction. It's really interesting. They're both grown up under the same roof, same food, same parenting, same discipline. My daughter, everything from a grasshopper to an elephant is a giant event in her life. She loves anything that moves, crawls, bites, cries, whatever. Whereas my son loves to hunt and fish, loves game capture, loves the action, but he's not going to get a pair of binos and go and watch birds, whereas she'll watch them all day long. And so I think you've got to let kids be who they are. But I think that screens are dominating the current children's lives. And that's actually, to be honest, Mark, one of the reasons that we've put so much effort into my daughter's pages is because if kids can watch conservation content and be entertained by another kid catching elephants or moving giraffes or picking up spiders or whatever, that's way better than watching somebody, see how much chewing gum they can put in their mouth,
100%. What's your daughter's pages, just for anybody that's listening or watching here?
So her Instagram's brookcarter.official and her YouTube's just Brooke Carter. And both of those have a very lively following. We post every day on those pages. She's got a team that does that. But like I say, on Instagram, it's at brookcarter.official. YouTube's just Brooke Carter and Facebook's brook.carter. Okay. And like I say, Mark, I wish there was more content like that out there because she doesn't have any agenda outside of showing kids how cool animals are. And one hopes is that some of those kids watching that start to believe that those animals are really cool and start to really care about them, because the divide between, I think half of the problem we've got with today's society is the divide between humans and wildlife is broadening. And as we are, there's a great quote, Mark, which I really, really like. If houseplants gave you Wi-Fi, every kid would want one. It's a pity all they give us is oxygen. And so when you think about that, we can't live without plants, but kids are putting, the very first thing that some of her friends will say when they come in the house is, "What's your password?" And we say, "We don't have one. We're not giving it to you. Put your phone away, go and ride the horse, go and play with the alpacas, go and, there's 1,000 things to do. We live in a very outdoorsy place. There's bicycles, there's skateboards, there's balls of every shape and size. Get out there and play. You don't need to be on your screen. Yeah, but I might have a message. So what? You answer it later. You can't get
Yep.
on our Wi-Fi. You
Yep.
know.
That's a great way to live. And it's a great quote too.
No, I like it. I like it. It kind of stops you in the tracks, you know.
Yeah, it does. So let's back up a touch. So everybody, I say my generation. I'm in my 40s now, but like I grew up watching you as a hunter on TV. So walk through like your hunting career and how that's kind of transitioned into the conservation that you're doing now. And I'm going to back up on that. Hunting is conservation, but a different type. You're highlighting conservation programs and projects, which is awesome. And I want to spend a ton of time on that. But I think I want everybody listening and watching just to hear you tell how it transitioned.
No, absolutely, Mark. And you know, to be honest, I think what you said there, you know, hunting is conservation. That's not necessarily true. We can unpack that in a little while. Hunting is an amazing source of money which can be used for conservation. I think that's a better way to put it. But
Yep.
just a quick note on you know, my journey, if you will. You know, as a kid, I was fascinated by everything that grew or moved. I mean, I wanted to know everything that I wanted to know the names of every plant I came across. I was excited by, and still am excited by, you know, wildlife, birds, animals, insects, how they all fit together, how the environment works, biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, I didn't really put my mind to it when I was at school, so I never really got to. I flunked out of high school, and that was the end of that. And I went straight on to working at a rehabilitation center in southern Zimbabwe, you know, rehabilitating wildlife, you know, injured, sick baby animals, and getting them back into the wild. And that was a very fulfilling. I mean, I was young. I was, you know, 17, 18 years old. And yeah, it was a very fulfilling way to kind of dip your toe into the conservation world. That led to, you know, me starting my guiding career, which started from a photographic or a non-hunting perspective. And I moved to a place in Zimbabwe called Lake Kariba, where I guided by boat and by foot and by vehicle, and spent a lot of time in Zimbabwe, you know, guiding safaris, non-hunting safaris, whereas, you know, hunting was always a great passion of mine, and it was kind of waiting for a door to open. I then, you know, happened to be having lunch with a friend. It's really interesting how these twists and turns in our lives actually happen, Mark. You know, you look down and, you know, it's all in God's plan, but you could never have written that out as a story. It's just, you know, so anyway, I had lunch and this guy said, look, actually, you know, I know you've been interested in hunting. Would you like to join one of the safaris as an apprentice? I said, absolutely. I would love to do that. As it turned out, I got to the camp. Now you got to imagine this environment. I'd never really done much hunting before. As a kid, lots of little stuff, loved bird shooting, lots of fishing and hunting small antelope. I got to camp and the professional hunter that was supposed to be guiding the safari had a kidney stone.
Ooh.
And he said, bud, you got to take the guy out tomorrow. Off you go. Yeah. And I mean, I didn't even know the area. And so that was kind of thrown straight into the deep end. Fast forward to, you know, a few years later, I'm very, very, very passionate about elephant, Mark. I really love time close to elephant, spent a huge amount of time pursuing elephant. And what I realized was that the people that I was guiding, I got to really like them. And I also realized very few people do the same hunt twice. So you spend 2 weeks hunting an elephant with a guy, hunting a buffalo with a guy, hunting, you know, whatever the animal might be, a crocodile. And you realize you've made friends with this guy, but you're probably not going to ever spend quality time with him again unless you hunt together. And so I decided that, you know, I would try and get licensed in other countries. So I ended up getting licensed through my career. You know, I've guided hunts in Cameroon and Central African Republic, in Mozambique, in Botswana, and Zimbabwe, and Namibia. Obviously, you know, all of the peripheral countries to that where there's viable, you know, big game opportunities. And what you realize as you go through these places is that the exceptional hunting only occurs where there's exceptional biodiversity, which can only occur where the ecosystem is really healthy. Because the biggest species, I don't care whether it's an elk, whether it's an elephant, whether it's a lion, are only going to occur where there's the healthiest biodiversity. And that's become very relevant to me as time has gone on. You know, when I was at school, I remember everybody talking to us in geography about there being 4 billion people on Earth, and everybody was shocked by that number. Well, now it's 8 billion people on Earth. And Mark, with 8 billion mouths to feed, there really are only 4 land uses. So we can use land to live on, which highly modifies it. It's highways, it's high rises, it's lots of concrete and rooftops. So we use the land to live on. We use the land to grow our food on, which I don't care whether you're a carnivore or a vegetarian. Our food is grown in a wildlife holocaust. Even if you're a vegetarian, there's no wildlife allowed to exist in the soybean field that you make tofu from. I just want to make that clear. And so, you know, we've got this land that is highly modified to grow our food on. Then we've got, you know, mining and timber. Now, your table that you're sitting at, the table that I'm sitting at one point was a tree. The concrete wall behind you at one point was rock in the ground. So we can't do without mining and timber. And so the people who think we can are deranged, because we cannot do without that. So now that's, you know, mining and forestry, living, agriculture. There's only one land use where the land can stay intact, and that is tourism. If we want to go and see mountains and explore wilderness areas, whether it's with a rifle or a camera, doesn't matter. That is the only thing that can support that landscape where it doesn't have to be highly modified. And so this mixture of hunting as a means of generating money, for that money to in turn be used for the conservation of the landscape, the photographic tourism that flows very healthily through Africa, that is a means of income for that landscape to be preserved. Both of those are very viable land uses. However, both of those, if your quota is too high, you destroy the landscape. If your quota of people coming to look is too high, you destroy the landscape. You know, and so there's this balance. So getting back to my journey, what I realized when my kids came along was that there was landscape that I used to run around in as a kid, hunting and fishing and enjoying the wilderness and participating in it, that today was just landscape used for feeding people. And, you know, in the middle of all of this hunting and guiding and so on, I stumbled upon television, where initially it was all hunting television, outdoor channel, pursuit channel, all the normal avenues that we start in. We then ended up, I partnered with Jim Shockey. We ended up doing some conservation television, which really took off. We did a couple of seasons of a show called Carter's War, which was all about, you know, conservation and what was going on there. Then we did a season of television called Heroes, which really spoke to where the money came from conservation, the hunters' dollars, the Pittman Robertson funding, which comes from guns and ammo, you know, all of that stuff. You know, we did a whole series on how landscapes are preserved using, you know, very often what's an uncomfortable truth is the hunters' dollars, the tag fees, the stuff that, you know, in South Africa, for instance, all of the daily rates that hunters pay, which has made it worthwhile. A lot of sheep farmers converting to wildlife, all of those things. So we've done, you know, I've hosted over 90 episodes, Mark, on that kind of television. And what that resulted in was a very deep knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. Because you'd arrive in a landscape and talk to some experts and make a TV show and have this deep dive for several days into a landscape or a species. And you start to realize what works, what doesn't work, what kind of philanthropic funding is very valuable, what is not valuable at all. You know, and so as my kids arrived, that was a real turning point, because realizing that some of these wildlife areas were no longer viable made me realize who on the planet should be looking after them. Well, the reality is it's you and I. It's the people who love the outdoors. I think for most people listening to a podcast like this, you can agree that some of your best moments in your life have been in the outdoors. Whether it's quietly sitting in a tree stand, watching the world unfold around you as it gets light, whether it's hiking up a mountain and glassing over a band of sheep that may be the only people that have ever looked at those sheep in their lives. And those kind of moments can only be preserved by people like you and I. And so we founded a foundation. It's based in Florida. It's a 501c3. And we raise money from people who care about wildlife and deploy it into Africa, but very differently to a lot of the other NGOs, in that from living and breathing the very front line of conservation, we understand what works, Mark. We know what's needed. We know how to do big translocations of wildlife. We're not designing a conservation action plan sitting around a boardroom table in Chicago or New York. We're doing it sitting underneath a mango tree in the middle of Africa with a tribal component at that table, so we can truly understand what's going to move the needle. And I think that's what's made a big difference. And so my life has kind of morphed into this combination of guiding a few trips, filming a lot of conservation television to try and educate the general public. When I was a kid, social media wasn't even a thing. It is a thing now, and we owe it to society to put good stuff on social media. So they're not watching, the junk that you see people scrolling through. They're getting to watch meaningful content. And then obviously running the foundation takes a certain amount of time, and the fundraising component of it, I'm really bad at asking for funding, which means that, I would rather show what we're doing and hope that people decide to include us in their giving plans. And then, rather than having one fundraiser after the other, which takes more money than you could ever raise. And so, that's kind of, in 5 minutes, that's kind of where I'm at and what I'm doing, and having lots of fun doing it,
That's what you always seem to have a smile on your face. One of the questions I had for you, and this is a lot of listeners, viewers will have never been to Africa before, so there are a lot of misconceptions. But one of the things I wanted you to cover, being who you are, what's the difference between managed Africa and unmanaged Africa? Being where great conservation is taking place versus to where there has been no conservation that had a plan in place or anything that what does that difference look like? The cold hard truth of it, what the news doesn't cover.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, Mark. A really good question, actually. So I think in very broad terms, unmanaged Africa are these large tracts of land that the government has set aside for somebody to bid on as a concessionaire. So Mark Peterson and Ivan Carter decide we want to be hunting outfitters, and we go and we bid on 2 million acres of Botswana. And in that 2 million acres, we are allowed to put a camp. We are going to have a very set quota, a very low quota, actually, of animals that are allowed to be harvested there. And the government is going to receive a huge amount of money from it, as is the local community that actually physically owns that land. Now, that land is probably completely unmanaged. It probably has no anti-poaching. It probably has a very, very sparse network of roads. And it probably has, as close to a very natural balance of wildlife as could be possible in modern times. Now, when I say no anti-poaching, that's a double-edged sword. So by no anti-poaching, it means nobody truly looking after the area, but that also means that by virtue of the remoteness and the fact that people are living there, that there could have been a fair amount of poaching. So some species of wildlife may be sparse. And so the juxtaposition to that, Mark, the opposite of that is very well managed private land, which would be, so a concession. It's not unusual for a concession in Tanzania or in Botswana to be in excess of 1 million acres. That's not unusual at all. And in that 1 million acres would be literally 1 or possibly 2 camps. You could probably drive all day for 5 days in a row without being in the same place twice. And so it's very, very big and wild. You've got no idea what's on there. And you've also got no idea of what each day is going to hold. The opposite of that is a very well-managed estate. When I say an estate, a privately owned piece of land in South Africa or Namibia, where in order to have that, you have to have what's called a certificate of adequate enclosure, which means it's got to be high fence to a certain standard. And that's not only to keep the wildlife in, it's also to keep people out. But also, Mark, because in South Africa, there's a rule where the animal stands, thereby it is owned. So if there's a buffalo standing on my land, I own it. Now, that buffalo is worth a bunch of money. I don't want it to cross the fence and stand on your land, because you would be well within your rights to shoot it if you wanted to, because you would own it. And so I want to keep my animals on my land. I will spend money going to game auctions, where the difference in South Africa and Namibia is wildlife is allowed to be owned. It's not state owned, which means that naturally occurring wildlife is owned, which means it's got a value. It can be bought and sold and traded, which is very, very, very good for wildlife, because as soon as something has got value, Mark and Ivan own a game park. We want lots of animals, so we can either sell them to hunters, we can sell them to live for other people to stock their game ranches with. But either way, when our wildebeest or our zebra give birth, that's good for us financially, which means more people want to get involved in that business, which means more land gets assigned to wildlife that used to be under agriculture or livestock. And so when we look at that, that's the main difference. So for the guy that wants a plains game safari that's not going to pay a huge amount of money, he is probably going to end up in South Africa. And I'm not saying that the hunting is bad just because there's a high fence. So, there's lots and lots and lots of discussion around that. A high fence around a flat land area of grass that's 10,000 acres, you can stand on top of your car and see the whole thing. A high fence that's around 10,000 acres of mountains, you know what that looks like. You're a sheep hunter. You may never, ever see every corner of that in 10 years of living there. And so what I look at is I say, is your area big enough for there to be fair chase? In other words, is it big enough that somebody could go on a safari there and not manage to get what they're after and not have to pursue a certain individual animal? It's a species, but not an individual. If the answer is yes, well, then you've got fair chase. And the difference as well, Mark, is if you've got a government concession that's 2 million acres, and Mark and Ivan own that concession and we build a camp, we only have that concession for 5 years. So we're going to build a camp that's a viable camp for 5 years. It's going to be probably a tented camp. It may have grass walls on it. It's going to have some pathways that our staff sweep every day so that you're going to get between the dining room tent and your living quarters. You may have a bucket shower. You may have a flush loo. If you and I own our game ranch and we've invested all this money, we're going to build this beautiful lodge with, brick and mortar. It's a permanent fixture. It's probably got a very good chef in it. It's probably got all of the infrastructure and the fixings of a really nice hotel anywhere else in the world, but it's only for, 4 or 6 beds. And so I'm not saying one experience is better than the other. Both experiences are African experiences, provided the one thing that exists, provided there is fair chase. And so provided the land that's privately owned is big enough for you to have fair chase, you're going to have a wonderful safari experience there. You're going to get some extra things you weren't expecting. You're not going to get some stuff you were hoping for. And the same thing applies to an open land area as well.
Now, on the open land areas, explain the relationship that the outfitting group PHs have with the local communities and how they help the infrastructure of the area and the meat donations and everything. It's one thing, like I think in the U.S. when the general public sees the meat donation happen, I don't see very many of them that are articulated correctly of what that actually is.
So, Mark, let me start with the biggest lie of people who travel to Africa to hunt, because that's always the elephant in the room. People say, oh, no, we go and hunt because we help build schools. We go and hunt so we can provide meat for the community. We go and hunt so that we can dig wells so that the people can have clean water. That's not true. We go and hunt because we love the pursuit of game. The money that we pay to hunt may be used for the benefit of community, building schools, clinics, digging water wells, anti-poaching, infrastructure for the wildlife, protection for the endangered species. That is where the money may be used for, but it's not the reason we hunt. And I think if we start every defending conversation with a lie, you don't go in the mountains to kill a sheep for any reason other than you love to be in the mountains in pursuit of sheep. You couldn't say, well, it's actually so my tag fees can be used for sheep conservation, because then you'd just write a check. And so we have to start that argument with, well, I go to Africa for some very personal reasons, and I actually love the pursuit of African game. However, the money that I spend in Africa benefits the landscape and the communities in the following ways. That's the right way to say that to make that argument. And so getting back to the whole meat distribution, one thing I think, people don't realize, if you have always had a full belly, you thereby can afford to be choosy about what you eat. And so I always say that appreciating the beauty of a wild animal is a concept that can only be understood by someone who's not hungry. Because as soon as we're hungry, we don't appreciate the beauty of the animal. We lust after its food value. And what's really interesting, in many of the African languages, the name for animal is nyama, which also means meat. So in Swahili, you talk about wanyama, which means the animals in plural. You could also talk about different steaks sitting on a barbecue, and that is also wanyama. And so it's interesting, at its very root, wildlife is seen as food first. And so the thought of waste is absolutely a first world concept, because everything is eaten. Now, there's a few species that are not eaten, that are heavily pursued, and you have to look at the business model and say, okay, well, a lion may not be eaten. Someone's going to say, oh no, well, I was in a camp where it was eaten. But let's be honest, that wasn't usual. A lion is usually not eaten. However, the money generated from the pursuit of a lion goes a very long way in preserving the landscape for the rest of the lions, as well as the schools and the clinics and the water wells and all of that stuff. Now, I think one of the things that we have to be very honest with ourselves as hunters is quota is everything. As long as a quota is adhered to. So, Mark, somebody asked me what is the best way to explain a viable quota to somebody who doesn't know. So think of an endowment. An endowment, again, for those who are listening who may not understand, what an endowment is where Mark and Ivan put a lump of money into an account. We agree to never touch it. We put it into an interest-bearing account, and we only ever spend the interest. What that means is forever, that money is going to yield an interest, and we're going to have money to spend. Now, wildlife is the same way. If you look at your core population of wildlife as your endowment, and you only ever shoot a quota of old bulls that are yielded by that core population, the core population will be there forever. You'll never overshoot it. What ends up happening, people get greedy, they want more money, they start to shoot a few too many bulls, now they start shooting a bit younger bulls, and before you know it, you are now spending your endowment, which means that the whole system is likely to collapse. So quota setting is absolutely key. So in an area of Botswana, for example, I'll take an area called CT2. It's 2.5 million acres. And I think they get 11 elephant bulls on quota there each year. And at any one time, you could count several hundred on that property. Now, an elephant bull that is, of a viable, I want to call it a trophy quality. And some of the listeners are immediately going to say, well, it shouldn't be seen as a trophy, but let's just say it how it is going to be an old elephant bull. And so based on the fact that an old elephant bull is going to be over 40 years old, you've got to have several hundred of them in order to yield 11 old bulls each year. And to see that happen. And so I think quota is absolutely key, Mark. And if we are going to see these areas survive into the future, they've got to be able to make a viable amount of money each year from that harvest that can then go back into the area for a number of reasons. Number one, if the community is not receiving enough meat or enough money, they're going to say, well, we should change the system. Let's get rid of these outfitters and let's just kill and eat the animals. That's much better. And so one's got to be very mindful of the perspective of the people who actually own the land. In that, I mean the governments and the communities that live there. And provided the governments are getting a good payout and the communities are getting meat and benefits, that land is always going to be left for the wildlife.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody asked you, compare, and you've done a great job breaking down the African conservation model, compare the African conservation model to the North American conservation model.
So the North American conservation model is very fundamentally different. Now, there's two things that make it very different. Number one is the government control of tags and those fees, and the fact that those fees have to get spent back into the wildlife. And then also something called the Pittman-Robertson Fund, which is an 11% tax that's levied on all guns and ammo, even guns and ammo not for shooting. So what people don't realize is 87% of all shooters and all shots fired in America are shot in closed ranges, on sporting play ranges, on skeet ranges, on, people going for the weekend and shooting at an indoor range with their handguns. All of that stuff generates an 11% tax at retail that has to, by law, be used for conservation, which means that there's about $2.5 million a day spent on conservation from Pittman-Robertson money, but the states that apply for that money have to match it, and they usually match it with tag fees. So, again, what's very different is just the simple scale of the American economy puts it in a completely different realm, where the laws surrounding wildlife management are self-funded by wildlife management. So you've got a certain quota of ducks, of bears, of white-tailed deer, of elk, of moose. Every one of those has a tag that has to be paid for, and that tag fee, 100% of that, goes back into the coffers of that state for the wildlife management. It pays for game wardens' salaries. It pays for research. It pays for infrastructure. It pays for the maintenance of the landscape that those animals survive on. And now you add to that the Pittman-Robertson money, it makes it a fundamentally different model. Now, when it comes to the actual where you can hunt model, the public land system in North America doesn't exist in Africa. So the public land system, where you and I can draw a tag and we can look, if we're in Utah, we know that on BLM land we can use a tag, provided we're in the right unit. We've got all of these rules about where that tag can be utilized. If we're living in Michigan, there's very little private land in Michigan, but you've got these vast areas of public land that you can go and hunt on, unless you've got a friend who's got a farm and he will allow you to come with your tag and hunt a whitetail on his farm. In Africa, the tag is owned by the land. In America, the tag is owned by the person, which means if you're a very generous landowner and you don't care about quality deer management, you could have 40 of your best friends come onto your 10-acre plot on opening day and they could all shoot a whitetail, which means that there would be none left on your plot at the end of opening day. Whereas in Africa, if you only had a 10-acre plot, you may only have one tag for that. And so the person would have to draw the tag for that area. Now, I know there's areas in America that are the same way, and there's a very complicated draw system. And I think that when you look across the board in the different models that the different states in America have, the way that they are governed is very, very good. You don't have that quality of governance in Africa, and you don't have concessionaires buying giant chunks of land from government. When I say buying, leasing giant chunks of land from government. Those leases are normally from private individuals. So if you go to Texas, so much of the land in Texas is privately owned, and they practice quality deer management. But for Mark and Ivan to go and have a great hunt, we have to go onto someone's lease And that lease is usually another private individual's land. It's not government land that's being leased. So there's some really big fundamental differences, but it's no different to, drawing an elk tag for a particular unit. There's only going to be a certain number of elk allocated to that unit, and those are going to be very valuable tags. But a giant proportion of that money that is paid at auction for those prime tags goes back into elk conservation or sheep conservation or mountain goat conservation or whatever the species is.
So now I love how we've talked the hunting in Africa and North America. Now I really want to dig on what your passion is now. So you started with these conservation projects in Africa and then kind of transitioned to North America. Now you basically do them all over the world. Talk through that road of how you did that, how you started them Africa with the collaring and the moving and so forth. And now you've stepped into North America and basically everywhere. Explain how that all took place.
Yeah, so Mark, really, really interesting journey. I've always been fascinated by catching animals, by moving animals, by the research that can come from collaring animals. And so as I realized that the wildlife of Africa needed help, which was just a maturity thing on my part, when I was really young, all I wanted to do was get out there on adventure. And I didn't really care how that adventure existed. I just wanted to be part of it. As you get older, you realize that those areas where that adventure happens, they are well managed, and that's curated stuff, if that makes sense. And so I started by looking and saying, well, why wouldn't this be possible? Or why wouldn't that be possible? Why wouldn't we be able to just translocate lions from an area where there's too many to an area where there's too few? Yep. And as many people as told me that's not possible, you'll never do it, that motivated me to actually do it. And so, we were lucky enough. We partnered with the Cabela Family Foundation. And as you probably know, we reestablished a lion population that was fully extinct. We did the largest translocation of lions, anywhere in Africa. And that was in 2018. And today, those 25 lions are well over 100. It's a fully established population. It regained 2.5 million acres into the wild lions home range. And so a violently successful thing. And what I'm excited to tell you is we did all of that, Mark, without a single boardroom meeting, not even one. It was all planned. We had in-house scientists. We didn't ask permission from the experts. Mm-hmm. We hired experts. And we didn't get tied up in politics. We didn't get tied up in all the people who said we couldn't do it. We just did it. Mm-hmm. And that led us and empowered us to really start looking at other stuff. And so step one of all of conservation has got to be finding people that are passionate about it, that are prepared. Every single action we do, you've got to have people who know how to do it. You've got to have a real need, and then people who've got the money that they prepared to put into your action. And so what the very first steps were educating people. And we've done that through television, through our conservation episodes, through making films about the work that we do. And so we have a company in Cape Town called the Conservation Film Company. And we've called it that because we don't do BBC wildlife stuff. We're not going to go and sit for 3 years and make a film about newts in a particular stream in England, or sit on the side of a mountain and make a film about mountain goats with the most beautiful mountain goat footage. Yes, we want to have beautiful wildlife footage, but we want to talk about the translocation of mountain goats for conservation. We want to talk about problems facing sheep populations in, North Dakota, where they've got, certain lung diseases from contact with domestic stock. And, what's being done about that? Where does the money come from that? How does that get funded? Who's telling those stories well? And so, one just kind of I hate to say it like this, you get sucked into the vortex. And as you do these things, Mark, it's just fun to do them. And it's fun sitting in a helicopter and catching animals. It's fun doing really cool things. And when you look over your shoulder, you've really made a difference. The pursuit of wildlife is one thing. The pursuit of conservation is a whole different thing. And we do these trips, which are generally in Africa, where, we'll be looking for money for a translocation of elephant, for example. And rather than saying, hey, Mark, will you donate to this? I'll say, hey, Mark, you know what? Why don't you bring your family on a trip to Africa, fund this translocation, but you can be on site with us while we're catching these elephants. Your kids are going to be helping write notes. Some of them are going to be holding the trunks open because they can't breathe through their mouths. They're going to be helping, watch them being lifted with cranes onto trucks. And then we're going to transport them 1,000 miles and release them into a landscape where there's not enough elephant. And when you participate in something like that, Mark, I mean, I get goosebumps even talking about it. It not only is it the coolest thing you've ever done, it's got this profound effect. You've got an effect on the community that lives with the elephants in the source landscape where potentially those elephants would have got shot if you didn't move them. You're having a profound effect on the elephants themselves, of course, because they would have been shot. And you're having a profound effect on the landscape you're delivering the elephants to, because that landscape, for whatever reason, didn't have enough of them. And so it's this amazing trifecta of success that makes it really exciting,
And I think you hit on a big point earlier, right? Like this all just doesn't magically happen. There needs to be funding behind it. And that's a great way to help raise funding, because you're giving an experience, right? And experience is what drives a great portion of the people is living for experiences. What the moving of elephants, I know you guys relocated giraffes into an area that hadn't had giraffes before. What other type of experiences like that are you doing?
So, Mark, all over Africa, we do, amazingly cool and fun experiences that people can come and participate in. We do a lot of giraffe stuff. We work closely with Giraffe Conservation Foundation. And what people don't realize is giraffe have gone extinct in 7 different African countries. There's 4 elephants in Africa for every 1 giraffe. So, as landscapes stabilize, as governments stabilize, it makes more habitat viable for us to put giraffes in. And a giraffe captures it's a very necessary conservation action, but it's also a really fun thing to participate in. Elephants, of course, catching them and collaring them so we can follow their movements. For crop raiding elephants, catching and collaring them so we can understand their spatial habitat use. All of that stuff, that's always a fun thing, catching elephants. You darting them from a helicopter. You getting to them quickly as soon as they go down, because you got to get their trunks free. And then you are participating in putting a collar on these enormous animals. When you put your hands on them, Mark, it's an amazing thing putting your hands on a big elephant bull that you're going to collar. Then 3 years later, you look at his data set, the data that's come out of his collar, and a giant amount of stuff can be learned from that. We do a lot of collaring of buffalo. We do a lot of rhino capture and moving, cheetahs, lions. Actually, this year, for the first time, we actually going to be putting some tags on whales off the Mozambique coast, because those whales, nobody's really sure where they all go. But in September, you can look out with binoculars, and every 10 minutes, you're going to see a spout. And so we're going to go out. We've got a whole bunch of whale tags that, people can come and participate in that and be sitting with us on the small boat. And you get up to these whales, and you've got this big tag that's got a spike on it, and you jab it in just right next to their dorsal fin. And every time they come up for air, that thing's going to send a message. And so again, it doesn't matter the species. There's so much research to happen, so much. Tomorrow, actually, I leave the house at 4:30 in the morning. We're going to go and catch a bunch of eland and kudu bulls to take DNA from them. Those are going to go to repopulate a new landscape. And then there's a whole research program to see if the biggest horned kudu and the biggest horned eland are actually the ones that are doing the most breeding. Because again, from the value of that animal, from both a trophy and a live sale perspective, that's very relevant information. So yeah, there's lots and lots and lots of stuff that we do. And if somebody phones me and says, I'm really passionate about big cats, I'd love to participate. We'll say, okay, well, this is what we've got going on with lions. You're welcome to come and join, and off we go.
How does somebody find out more information of what you're doing if there's somebody listening or watching right now that wants to help?
So if you're on social media, I'm on Instagram at ivan.carter. You can email me, ivan@ivancarter.com. or our foundation website, which is Ivan Carter WCA, which stands for Wildlife Conservation Alliance. So it's ivancarterwca.org, and there's all kinds of contact information on there, Mark.
Okay. Now, and as you've transitioned into North America conservation, how does like how do you choose which projects you're going to work on? Your schedule, like I think I talked to you last week. You were down in the Caribbean, then in the U.S. Now you're in Africa. Like you're all over the place. How do you choose which projects to focus on between Africa and North America?
So North America is really interesting, Mark. We've over the last few years done a lot of filming in North America. Really, North America is not looking for funding for wildlife, but you talk to a lot of the biologists, you talk to a lot of the game rangers on the front line, a lot of the forestry people. They wish that the general public knew more about what they did. Mm-hmm. And so our role, we are there as filmmakers. We go in, we embed ourselves with biologists, with researchers, with game wardens, with, people who are professionals in the industry. And, I think there's very few of our listeners really even understand the ins and outs of the Pittman Robertson Fund. Yeah. And the fact that every time you pull a trigger, a few cents goes to conservation is a great thing. It really is a great thing. But unless you understand that, there's going to be a lot of people that wish that tax didn't exist. So honestly, in North America, the conservation model is truly intact. You've got these auctions, whether it's at, Wild Sheep Foundation, whether it's at any one of these events, a huge amount of the tag fees, in fact, in a lot of cases, all of the tag fees for these large high dollar governor's tags, et cetera, go right back to that species, which means, again, in a nutshell, they're not short of money. They are very often yearning for more exposure. They want the general public that are the non-hunting public to understand that conservation model is propped up by tag fees and Pittman Robertson money. In other words, hunters and shooters. And so North America, what we choose is stuff that is going to be charismatic species. Again, very sadly, Mark, nobody wants to fund or watch a television show about soil conservation. Yeah. Yet without healthy soil, you can't have healthy grass. Without healthy grass, you can't have healthy ungulates. Without healthy ungulates, you can't have lions and leopards and all your charismatic species. So, going into North America, we choose the more charismatic species, whether it's moose or bears, or, I was just in Utah recently, going into bear dens with biologists and darting the bears and changing collars and understanding some of the really cool things they've learned about bears and the quota setting and so on. But all of that actually is funded by tag fees and Pittman Robertson money. And so really, I feel like our role as Conservation Film Company is telling those stories. And then a lot of people that want to get involved, we can point them in the right direction, and they can come and also participate in certain things. And there are a lot of places that people can put some money in. And, whether it's ocelot research and releases in Texas, whether it's, bear collaring on the Alaskan Peninsula, there's lots of really cool things that are going on. And, that goes for every wild landscape on the globe, actually.
And you mentioned the storytelling, and that's a big part, right? Because in today's world, that's how you do it. I would love to get your 2 cents on what you see from hunters on social media, what you currently see as them doing it, and then also what you see as a good way to show and the bad way you've seen.
So social media is this very interesting thing, Mark, where the deck is stacked against certain messaging. Because you've got an algorithm, in other words, a computer that is going to decide whether they show your stuff to people or not. And it's not a reasonable thinking person. It's just a computer. And the computer is told that if there's dead stuff, don't show it. If there's blood, don't show it. If it's negative, don't show it. And so if you look on our social media platforms, we have enormous growth. We have enormous engagement. But all we do is show it's our business. We monetize our social media, and I'm not ashamed to say We don't have any agenda on social media outside of bringing a bunch of eyeballs and telling people how cool wildlife is from a first-hand perspective. And so hunters, I think we can all argue that if we were in the trucking industry and somebody told you that green trucks were bad for business, overnight, nobody would have green trucks. Now, we all know that showing dead animals with lots of blood is bad for business. And somehow we carry on doing it.
Yeah.
And that's what's shutting us down, because for the first time ever in history, in the last decade, everybody's got a voice through social media.
Yep.
And so if you and I show a particularly bad video clip or photo of a charismatic animal being killed or dead, that's got a chance of going viral. If that goes viral, it will generate letters. Letters to the right people dictate policy, and policy can go against the conservation of whatever it is that we know and love and pursue, which means that really, when you think about it, is it worth that risk just for the ego of saying, look what I killed, to risk a policy change that could potentially shut that down? And as that shuts down, the conservation action that goes with the money that is generated by that species also shuts down. And so, Mark, I think we've got a lot of work to be done within the hunting community, within the hunting industry, to police each other and make it not cool to post stuff that we know can be harmful to the future of our pursuit, you know?
Yep, 100%. So looking in the crystal ball, putting your magic hat on here, what do you see the future 10 years, 20 years down of wildlife and hunting in Africa and the US? Like, does it look the same as it does today? What differences do you see coming down the road?
So, Mark, I think that we're at a pretty scary time. There's a lot of pressure from the anti-gun lobbies. And as we've explained, if the target shooting and the firearm ownership and use slows down in America, the conservation dollar slows down. That's quite scary. What that looks like in the future, I think that, you and I have been part of many conversations. We've shared many moments, whether it's sitting next to each other in a bus on the way somewhere or, chatting to each other at trade shows. One of the things that I think is quite scary to me is that the use of land for pure recreation in America is usually free or very close to free. And so that the management of that land relies on hunters' dollars and Pittman Robertson funding, which is quite scary, because the very people that are using it for free are very often the people that are anti it being utilized for hunting. So that's an interesting one. I'm not sure how that plays out, but there needs some balance. And I think the role that, you're a very accomplished filmmaker, people like you and I need to do a better job of explaining to the general public how that peregrine falcon sits on top of that rock. It sits there because of the protection of that landscape that protects enough biodiversity for there to be food for it. But none of the dollars that protect that landscape come from just the hiking person or the person wanting to take a photo of that peregrine. As far as Africa goes, I think that the model is really very strong, but the model relies on North American hunters as our primary market, closely followed by certain European nations and then Russia. It relies on those people coming and spending the dollars. So you need a few things to be in place for that to happen. You need political stability. You need a reliable service industry. But then the other piece of that puzzle, which is one of the places that the anti-hunters are attacking, is a lot of people won't hunt what they can't take the trophy home for. Now, what does it really matter? Provided the money has changed hands, provided the quota system is intact, and provided the conservation is happening, why does it matter whether or not somebody brings the horns home? That should matter not to an anti-hunter. But it really is an Achilles heel that they found, because there are a lot of people that will not go and hunt if they can't bring the trophy home. Now, whether or not that affects the quota, I can tell you right now, it doesn't affect the quota. All it does, so let's say let's talk about an animal like a buffalo.
Mhm.
So let's say North America, for some reason, said you can no longer import buffalo. No less buffalo are going to die because the marketing will just change towards Russia and Europe and, possibly Asia. The difference is that buffalo will die for less money. And so the same thing is going to happen, but less money will be generated from conservation. And so if you look in the eye of the anti-hunter, do they want the same thing to happen for less money, or do they want it to carry on for more money? And I don't know what their personal answer is. It's going to depend how far out on the scale of anti-hunting they are. But a good example is after Cecil the lion, there was a ban on the import of lion trophies from quite a lot of landscapes, one of them being Tanzania.
Mhm.
As a result of that ban, there were a lot of outfitters that no longer were viable. Now, I want to just explain to the listeners that, or the viewers, you may have a landscape that's, 4 or 5 or 600,000 acres in one contiguous block. And out of that block, you may only get 2 lions. And the way the laws work in Tanzania, you're only allowed to harvest a lion that's over 6 years old, which means that's a lion that's past breeding. He's already spread his genetics and he's not allowed to be part of a pride. So you're in a given season, you very seldom will fill your quota because it's very hard to find such a lion.
Mhm.
So you've got a very intact ecosystem, but every person that tries to shoot a lion, whether they shoot one or not, spends over $100,000 in that landscape.
Mhm.
Now you ban the importation of lion trophies, so those outfitters stop operating. A lot of the landscapes sat empty, nobody utilizing them at all because the lion outfitters had gone. And so those landscapes sat empty. The government then got under pressure from the community saying, look, the hunting outfitters are gone. We would like to settle that land. That land was settled. It was delisted as wildlife land. And now it's got crops and villages and all the lions are dead. So what was achieved by the ban was the expansion of land that humans grow their crops on and that they live on, and a shrinking of land by the tone of millions of acres that was assigned to wildlife. So the only thing that lost was wildlife. No humans lost in that deal. Only the wildlife lost. And so it's a misconception that you are saving wildlife by stopping hunting. You're actually destroying wildlife by stopping hunting. You're destroying the maintenance of these big wild landscapes. So coming back, I apologize. It's a really long way of answering your question, but I think hunting in Africa, my kids are going to see it viable and vibrant. I think the change is going to be in the type of person that travels to hunt. One of two things is going to happen. It's either going to be people who travel to hunt who don't travel with their own firearms and don't bring trophies home. Those people are still going to spend their money, and their money is going to be very welcome in the conservation world. I think the traditional hunter who travels across to Africa and brings home elephant tusks or lion trophies or, leopard skins or crocodiles, I think those people are probably not going to exist in another couple of decades. But I think that the beauty of being out in the wilderness as a full participant is not going to be lost. Your kids are going to be doing it. My kids are going to be doing it. There's a lot of people that are going to still be doing it, but just under a different umbrella of circumstances and rules. But ostensibly on the ground, it's going to look the same. People are still going to be staying in camps, going out, pursuing wildlife and enjoying that pursuit. I really believe that to be true.
I sure hope so, and I know we're fighting to keep it that way for as long as we can. I couldn't imagine my kids not being able to do the things that we did when we grew up.
Absolutely. No, and I think, sustainable. I like to say, Mark, that the two words that need to go in front of the word hunting in order for it to be viable, it needs to be sustainable and ethical. Provided there's a code of ethics and provided it's on a sustainable quota, then I think it's an amazing tool for generating money that can be used for conservation.
100%. Well, we covered a ton today, Ivan. So I want you to end today for anybody that's listening right now, how can they reach out if they want to help you with any of the things that you guys are doing with your organizations? What's the best way in even if it's something they can't do now, but in the future, what's the best way in to follow along?
I think the very best way, Mark, is as simple. Everybody's on social media these days. Look me up on Facebook. Give us a follow and a like on Instagram. Follow along. We reply to every message we get on there, and that is very often the very first contact we get for people interested in participating in some of the things that we do. And Mark, hopefully the next time we sharing a screen like this, it's going to be doing something in Africa with a crew, you know?
That's what I hope. That's what I hope. Hopefully not just randomly sitting down on a bus and looking over and seeing you again.
Exactly. Well, we look forward to being face-to-face, Mark, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you to everybody who's listened to this. Hopefully it's been entertaining and valuable.
Well, thank you, Ivan, and thank you for everything that you do for conservation.
Thank you so much, Mark.